then another or line, and then you have the
Hey,
function
Chris?
that comes afterwards, and it uses the parameters inside there.
Do you want us
And
to
the
talk
only reason
about?
that I for that is because that's very closures inside of like Python and Swift. In closure syntax, you basically have a random variable that you define there, and it can infer what type of variable it is and the rest of it, and you can just work with it.
Speaker for
So that's like the only reason
his
I'm
company
used to that. Otherwise,
criticism
I'm
is
just
going to be
sitting there
buying the
looking
second
at
round
it.
of beer.
Okay, I'll let you announce on that.
Yeah, I'll announce that.
All right, cool.
So we're going to open up, and then you'll be able to go.
All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Everybody, grab a slice and a seat, and we'll get going here. Slice and a seat. That's right.
Yes. We have very interesting ways we say things around here.
Slice and a seat, unusual.
No? He was laughing at me earlier.
Oh.
Because I said, oh, so you can't access my stuff off of like Cloud Call. Just telling everybody that we have separate
Yes.
Wi-Fi things, so you can't access my stuff.
Everything's separated. All right, is this thing on? Yes, it is. We got a green light. So.
Yeah, we're on. That's on.
All right.
Streaming's ready to go.
All right, cool. So thank you guys for coming out. I'm Todd, one of the founders here at CloudSpace. I know you guys are used to seeing Mike Miller. He is in Boulder with 5 or 6 members of the team kicking off a big new project this week. So asked me to come say hey to everybody. So tonight we're doing good old iOS and looks like Swift, which is awesome. And we have 3 speakers tonight instead of the usual 2, which is very cool. Want to first start by thanking sponsors. We got Lazy Moon Pizza. We've got World of Beer, where we're buying the first round after the event this evening, and also Red Bull, as always, fueling the evening. So outside of that, we also are going to open things up after the third talk tonight, where if any of you guys have been struggling with any small tech problem, having any little challenges, a question of how to do something, going to open the floor up for a few minutes for anybody who would like to. If there is anybody, come up and talk about something they're working on now, challenge they're facing. You know, not a lot of show and tell. There's lots of time to do that around Orlando, kind of everywhere. Yeah. But really, if you're having a tech challenge that you're hitting and you want to kind of get a little bit of the brain trust to solve it that's here, we're going to open up the floor for a little bit of that this evening. With that, we'll turn it over to Caitlin. You can take it from there.
All right.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for showing up. Actually, a pretty decent little tonight, which is exciting considering the fact that UCF has started some of their meetups now. So, pretty happy about that. Also, to Criticism, correct?
Got it.
Woo! Criticism's buying the second round of beer at World of Beer. So definitely stick around. It's pretty awesome. He's here from San Francisco for an app conference that's going on here in Orlando. So he'll also be our third talk of the night. And to bounce back off of the whole talking about any problems that you guys have, I'm going to open that up for all 4 meetups. So as long as it's a JavaScript problem or a problem with Android or in Ruby, something that you're working on that you've got a problem with and you want to pick somebody's brain who might actually be an expert in it and might actually know, come up here and quickly talk about it. It's Orlando Tech does the demos. You're more than welcome to demo what your product does, talk about how cool it is, how awesome it is at Orlando Tech meetups. Here, if you got a problem with it or a problem on something and you want help, we'll help you out with there. Because we usually have some of our guys that stick around at all of them, and then we also have other experts who usually show up. So, brain you might pick. Also, too, I'm always looking for speakers. I just need March iOS, Android, and Ruby. So I'm feeling pretty good on my speakers. February is filled. It's the first time that has ever happened for me where I'm not chasing down speakers the week before. So it's good. Definitely come up here and speak. You don't have to be a great speaker. As long as you're passionate about something that you're talking about or you like it, talk about it. Open for beginner talks as well now, because now we've been having a lot of technical, and now I'm definitely open for some beginner talks as well. So with that being said, Amit, let's have you go ahead and give your talk. Put this on. That way people on YouTube. Oh yeah, we do live stream these, by the way. They're all being saved on YouTube. If you go to University Tech Meetups on YouTube, that is the channel that we have now, and you will be able to see all 4 meetups on the YouTube. And it's just based off of, you know, when I have my little funky names for each meetup, like this one's Breaking iOS. Just look up University iOS, Breaking iOS, all within University Tech meetups on YouTube. So.
But we're not breaking iOS.
No, we're not breaking this. There's a funny story with all that.
Oh, you have to share that.
I'll share it in between while everybody's looking around.
Hi, I'm Amit Bishlani at Paradox on Twitter. So show of hands, how many of you know anything about Swift at all? Wow, okay. All right, well, I picked a little advanced topic here because I'm a little bit about functional programming, but I'm gonna also show you the what and how and why of it. So hopefully I won't spend too much time on the code because there is a lot of code here. I work for a company called Treehouse. I used to be the iOS teacher there. Now I work on their iPad app, which is, moved over to the mobile team because I was just missing working on stuff, So what I'll do now is, of course, all of you've experienced using JSON, right? Even if it's in Objective-C. Yes? No? All iOS developers here or no? Show of hands? Okay, right.
Better than XML.
So what I did was I took the Twitter timeline and we're going to use that as an example. So as any JSON payload, it's nested, it has properties that have all different data types. You have booleans, you have strings, you have dates, you have links, all kinds of different data types, right? And the question is, you dig down and extract the information. Now, of course, you can do that. There's a crude way of doing that, or there's a really elegant way of doing that. So I found several examples online. When Swift came out, people started talking about functional programming, and all the Haskell guys came out, and they were like, how you would do it using functional programming, and there are monads and functors and fmaps, and I was like, what is this stuff? So I'm not saying I'm an expert at this, but I'm curious. And my curiosity lends me to dig into this, and I love to share. That's why I was a teacher, because I just love sharing stuff. And I think that's the best way for me to learn. Because I dig into this stuff, I share. So this is the basic JSON parsing code. It's very similar to what you would do in Objective-C. You have the NSJSON serialization class. You give it data, and it parses the data, and you get back an array or dictionary, and that's what the JSON object there is. Don't worry if you're a little confused about this, but you'll see where I'm going with this. So once you have the JSON object, which is an array, you have this crazy if-let syntax. So for those of you that don't know Swift or don't know about optionals, I think I have a slide here. So here's what an optional is. It's an enumeration, so you have two cases. Either you have a value or you have nothing. That's what none is. So basically what happens is that once you're parsing JSON and you extract information, so let's say there was something in the Twitter timeline, maybe a link. I know there's a property there for links or something like that. And there was no, oh, there you go, expanded URL. So that's no. So sometimes there's a value, and sometimes it's a null. So that's what optionals do for you. They say like, hey, here is a value, but it might be null too. So when you're extracting the information, you want to extract it safely. So here, that's why you have the if-let syntax. You're saying if-let status is array as JSON, as array. So you're casting that object into an array. So you're saying, here's this information. It's actually an array, but it's an optional because I don't know if this is going to actually be there. I don't know if it's nil or not. And that's what the optional does. It wraps it. So it's saying, the case saying that case sum t, the t is basically any generic data type. So either you have something in there or you don't. So if you have something in there, then the if-let statement gives you back that information safely. And that's what Swift is all about. Everything has to be safe. So you have this nesting going on where I actually take the array, then I take the first element from that array, which is the status, then I get the user. So if I go back here, you can see that this is an array. That's what the box brackets are. And Of course, I have just one user here, but I'm just basically going down the nesting. I'm going down the array, I'm getting the first element, I'm getting the user, and then all I want to do is get at the username, which is what the last if-let statement. And the reason we use if-let is because that's the safe way of what they call unwrapping an optional. Because what you get back is not a value. Like this last if-let statement, if I just did user box brackets names, box bracket name, all it would do is like give me back an optional. And the optional has the value inside that case. So it'll actually be like some name. But I want to get at the value, the string. So to get at the value, the string, that's what the if-let is. So finally I get the name, which I return back. Any questions so far? I know it's probably a lot to take in. So that's what optionals do. So there are a few key data types here. You have an any object, which means that this could be any data type. So your dictionary looks like you have a key, which is a string, and then you have the value, which is any object. And then you have the array, which is basically, it could be any object in your array. So just for a little sanity, you can use something called type alias, so that when I'm reading this code, it makes more sense to me. So any object, I can just say it's a JSON object because I'm parsing JSON data. And then JSON dictionary would be like string, and the value is any JSON object. I mean, it's not necessary, but it just makes your code look more elegant. So the first thing that we can implement when it comes to functional programming is this thing called either, which is a type. It's either sends you, similar to the optional, you know, either is also like the optional where you actually have a value or you have nothing. In our case, we can either return an error or we can return a value, because you could have problems parsing the JSON, so you want to maybe return an error. But if you do successfully parse and get at that username, then you can return a value. Now the only problem with this syntax is that it'll cause a compiler error because enums actually require you to specify a data type with the value here. It can't be a generic. Here it's saying basically just pass me any data type, any object, and I can store it. But Swift doesn't have that ability yet. So you have to create a container class. I'm just going to gloss over this, but basically you're creating a read-only container class that will store that value, and this is what the enum actually looks like. Basically, you're boxing that value inside this container class. So we took all that information, all that line of code that we had, and we put that inside a function, and we called this parse data. So parse data has two arguments. It's taking in an instance of NS data. Once again, it's an optional. And then you have a callback closure. I'll show you how we're calling back that closure. But basically what we're doing here is if we get an error, then you're calling the callback closure with an error. So that's how we're using that result enum. We're passing in an error. And if we actually get the username, then we call back with a value. And if neither of these things happen, then finally we just call it with an error, just assuming that everything failed. So how do we call that parse data function? Well, we're assuming that that instance of NS data came from a network call. Like you used you got the data, and then you're passing in that instance of NS data. Or you're getting it locally from the disk or something like that. So I'm leaving that part out. And the other part, which is that's the function signature on top. I just copied that there so that we can see how we're matching that to the function signature. So you're calling that using a closure, and that's basically what the closure syntax looks like. You're passing in a parameter because it's expecting a parameter there. And then you use a switch case statement, which is the elegant way of using that result data type, that result enumeration, where you're saying, hey, if it's an error, print error, or do something with that error. And if it's a value, then do something with that value. Here I'm just printing it out. So with the closure, you can make that syntax a little more elegant, where you can just say result in instead of having to specify that whole parentheses and all that complicated syntax. You could simply say result in. Or you could take it one step further and provide a trailing closure. So as you can see here, we're doing 2 parameters. Here, we're simply doing the curly braces outside, and that's a trailing closure. Any questions? No. So going back to that crazy if-let syntax that I had going on there, we can clear this up because as you can see, all we're doing there is casting. And why cast manually when we can write functions to do that? So we can create cast functions that'll basically convert that JSON object to the relevant data type, which is also an optional. So here, as you can see in Swift, you're using optionals all over the place, you know. It's a pretty important type that they've created. So now that we have those casting functions, instead of having to manually cast it, we simply call those cast functions. So, of course, optionals lead to messy syntax, and this is where all the functional programming comes in. So first thing is monads. And monads has something called bind and return. So what it can do is it can bind an optional value to a function that takes a non-optional value and returns an optional value. Stay with me. So an optional value is wrapped. It's inside something. You don't have access to that value directly. So what a monad does, it takes that value out, it shoves it inside a function, and then it returns back value or an optional value once again. So this is kind of what a monad function would look like, where you have 2 generic data types, and then it's the first parameter you're taking in an optional, and the second parameter is actually a functional. It is a function that takes in that value and then returns back an optional. So of course, with functional programming, you have custom operators all over the place. So this is kind of what this is actually what the custom operator looks like for the monad. And so since the monad is using a function that does not take an optional value, we have to go back and modify our casting functions. And so this is what our if-let syntax now looks like. You have, and it reads well too, you know, you're taking this JSON object and you're converting that into an array. You're taking that a status and converting that to a dictionary. It just reads really well, and that's what the custom operator does. Here, let me go back here. So basically you're taking that optional value, which you're getting from here on the left. So let's take that first if-let statement, right? So the JSON object isn't optional. You're passing that through this function, which is called JSON to array, and then it's returning back an optional, which is being unwrapped by that if-let statement. Sorry, I know. I'm saying this and I'm like, wow, that's just, crazy. And, but wait, there's more. I did not stop there. This goes on. Because I want to talk about functors and apply, Trust me, this gets better. Yeah, this is how you're going to be after this talk. So what is a functor? I really wanted to dig down and understand this because this sample that I looked at, it was a Thoughtbot article, and I was just like, I don't get it. I don't understand. So I just don't want to regurgitate something. I actually want to explain what this stuff is. So you have a value, and you want to apply a function, an addition function to that value to get a result, right? So you want to add 3 to that value to get a result of 5. It's very simple. But with optionals, you can't do that because it's wrapped. It's wrapped inside this enumeration, which says, well, you have a value, but it's inside this other thing. You can't get at that value directly. So what do? Well, you use a fmap function of a functor. So what that does is it says, take this function where I want to add 3 to this value, I do some magic, and I get 5, which is wrapped inside that value again. Well, what's that magic? So the magic, what it does is it unwraps that value, it applies that function, it gets that new value, it wraps it up, and it sends it back to you. That's what a functor really does. So if next time somebody asks you what's a functor, you don't need a PhD, You can just tell them that. So this takes it another step. Have the applicatives apply, which basically with the functor you had only one value wrapped and you had to apply this function. Well, imagine if that function was wrapped. What do you do now? Well, that's what the applicatives apply does. It unwraps the function, it unwraps the value, it puts the two together, and then gives you back a wrapped result. Welcome to functional programming. So if we had to go ahead and actually implement that, that's what it would look like in code. The first one is the fmap, and the second one is the apply. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to show you what the resulting code would look like. Here you're actually using all those 3 things, the monad, the functor, the apply, all of those 3 things to create this elegant piece of code that nobody else will understand but you, because you wrote that code in Swift. And if someone else comes to maintain that code, they'll be pulling their hair out. But it looks beautiful. Look at that. It looks very cool, and you have custom operators all over the place. Now, you can't get to this piece of code just by having these 2 custom operators, unfortunately. You need something else called currying. So I created a struct called user, which I've used here, right? It's basically a struct where I'm passing it the name, description, and followers count. It is a Twitter timeline after all, so followers count is important. It's a popularity contest, right? So, but I can't just use that to create, I can't just create an instance of user with all those custom operators. I needed to curry it. And basically, I've written the definition there. It's a very simplified definition of it, which says if you give a function fewer parameters, then it'll return a function with remaining parameters. Maybe that makes sense or not, but basically, as you can see the definition over there, you're actually chaining the parameters that you're taking in. It's not separated by commas. You're actually chaining that, and it's a static function. So that's what you use here with the user.create, and then you're applying the fmap, and then you're using the applies to create that user. The reason you is because remember, everything is wrapped inside an optional. You can't get at any of those values. So that's why you're creating all these custom operators that say like, hey, do you have a name? Do you have a description? Do you have a followers count? Great, now we can create a user. If you don't have one of those 3 things, then you might not be able to create a user. That's why you have to do all these crazy things and understand all this crazy stuff. But in the end, you have used all the paradigms of functional programming to create this beautiful code to parse JSON, which you could have done in my first slide, but it looked a little ugly. And to avoid all this if-let syntax, because everything is wrapped inside an optional. So here are a few links if you want to read that article, those pretty diagrams that I copied. There's a book by the OBC.io guys called Functional Programming in Swift. So if you're really interested in functional programming, it's an amazing book. They've done a really good job. I'm going to put up the slides to reference them.
Yeah, we'll put them up in the meetup.
Yeah.
And like the comments in the meetup, so that way you guys can go access it again.
That's all I got.
Any questions at all, guys?
Yeah.
This is why we do technical talks. Therefore, you guys can go home and go, hey, I
What the
need to
hell was
learn
that?
this. What was this again? All right, Andrew, you want to go ahead and get all set? Awesome. So make sure you guys didn't lose those tickets because I will be doing the give outs. So let's see. Is it gonna love us?
Probably.
Oh, it loves us.
Oh, it did it right?
Yeah. Whoa. It's blown up. You might need to play with your.
Get a ticket.
Oh, well then grab one. And put one of them in that jar. I don't want to know who got what ticket. 1080. I like it when the displays like to cooperate with us. Every so often it likes to try to do like, the two-player game where it splits it in half. Yeah, that happens to us quite a bit. All right, there you go, darling.
Okay.
Put
Oh,
stuff
I hit this up.
Just pocket on your shirt.
Like right here?
Yeah. That way you're good to go.
All right, cool. So my name's Andrew Owens. I'm going to be doing a talk on iOS. A little bit about me, I'm a computer science and physics major, and I worked at EA last year. So anyways, let's get started. So what is Metal? Metal is a highly efficient, low overhead graphics API for iOS, which pretty much gives you lower access to the hardware to enable you to write high performant code and GPU to CPU operation costs per frame. It allows developers to enhance the realism of their environments, improve physics and pathfinding API algorithms, and enhance stability of large draw calls. So a little bit more about draw calls. Making games is just inherently expensive. You've got to draw hundreds and hundreds of objects onto the screen per frame, and then that's millions of calls per session. And it takes the time for the CPU to process tasks, prepare, validate it, and then do a dispatch, which pretty much sends the information over to the GPU for execution. Dedicated memory and all that stuff. And so anyway, this is an average. Normally, mobile developers like to get at least a second on their games. And so essentially, this graph kind of shows you just that, as the CPU does its work, the GPU is sort of waiting to get that. And then as soon as it happens, the GPU does its work, and then we're in the next frame, and we just keep doing it again and again. The problem with this is that since the CPU is just slow, the GPU is just waiting, and it's not doing anything. And that's a lot of precious processing time that you could be using objects or add enhancements to your game. So how is Metal a solution to these issues? So it takes advantage of a unified memory model, which pretty much just means that the CPU and the GPU kind of share memory. It's sort of similar to what AMD's done with like a heterogeneous system architecture. Essentially, you're kind of leveraging your hardware and your software like on the board, sharing physical memory space so that you can get objects quicker. And then it builds shaders and any post-processing code into a library at compile time so that dynamically, as you're doing your frames, you're not trying to access different memory and then update your resources in real time. And that really is probably the biggest reason why Metal is so fast, and Apple claims that it enhances, like you can get 10 times the draw calls that you could before because you're able to access all that stuff statically. And then also, iOS devices implement this thing called tile-based deferred rendering architecture. It's pretty much the same thing as a heterogeneous system architecture, just because you're not doing reads and writes dynamically. You're just doing a call where the code is in a library somewhere, so you're not doing real-time compilation. And so a little bit more about the Metal API. So essentially, you've got all these different types of objects, and then the device is just a software abstraction of your actual GPU. You have your command queue, which is a sequence of the command buffers, and then your command buffer contains GPU hardware calls. And then your encoder translates your API calls, which you're doing in just regular code, to the GPU hardware commands. And then your state is your frame buffer, blend, depth, samplers, all that stuff. You have code for shaders, and then your resources are like your textures, data buffers, and all that stuff. And so just a little bit of how this all comes together and how Metal sort of does their rendering. So you see resources, which is your buffer and texture. You have some states, and then you have state. And this is, you kind of define this in something called a descriptor, and that's pretty much just the implementation of what these things are. And then you send it over to the command encoder, which translates it into the hardware commands. And then you put all of those cbuffs into a command queue, and then that sends directly to the GPU for execution. So yeah. And so Metal is multi-threaded, and you can also kind of interleave the different type of command encoders you have. So you have a render command encoder, a compute command encoder. You can even blitz stuff if you want to. But anyways, you can interleave these and put them all in one cbuff, and then put them into the command queue and send it to the device. And this just allows you to create more objects onto the screen at a faster rate, as opposed to having to, now I send all my rendering information, then I do my compute operations. I send that all sequentially to the device for execution. So this is a pretty cool model. And again, it sort of takes a lot of themes from AMD's HSA architecture. So yeah, the command encoder cuts out deferred state validation, which pretty much just means that, so anytime your GPU does something, it's got to check to make sure the state's correct or it's in the right format so that it can actually execute the command. So that cuts out all of that because you've already compiled all of your states and it's already stored in a Metal library when you first compiled your application. And then as, oh, that's a typo. As command buffs finish execution, it lets the application know so that it can continue to send different operations to the GPU. All right. And so even though you've already compiled essentially your Metal library, you can still dynamically update your resources just like you would regular code. Essentially, you can access your resources by a pointer, and then you can just change that. So for example, if you wanted to change your pixel representation from 16 to like, I think it's like 8 component B RGA or whatever, wherever you would want to do that. But you can do that in real time, as well as like sharing textures against different objects and stuff like that. And then I'm not going to talk too much about the Metal shading language, but essentially it's built on C++11. And also on the LLVM and Clang, which is similar to the PS4's Orbis framework, which is essentially the underlying framework for the PS4 operating system. But it allows you to do a whole bunch of optimization stuff, which is pretty cool. Like in the command line, you can do like, I think like TAC02, and then you can, it does like all this crazy background, and you enhance like your performance and stuff like that. And then it's got built-in support for sampling, rasterization, and compute operations. You know, you've got to add that in there just because a shader implements all this, so you've got to have a fast way to be able to represent it. And then supports function overloading and basic templating. This just makes writing shaders a lot easier, and you don't have to spend time implementing like a 100-line shader, and you can just kind of overload some functions and stuff like that to get different that you want. So Metal is a low overhead, high performance GPU programming API. It's designed and optimized processor, which pretty much just means that they're taking from AMD's HSA architecture and applying it to their own hardware because they design and produce it all from bottom to top. And that just gives the developer flexibility to kind of enhance what you can do with your games and stuff like that. And then, yeah, it's that good. It's that good, yeah. So that's sort of what I got. I wanted to probably do a second one that does a little bit more code and stuff like that, but I just wanted to give everyone like an overview of what Metal actually is and how it works. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I got. Yeah.
I got a question.
Oh yeah, questions.
What's the advantage between using this over OpenGL?
So I mean, you can't explain to me a little bit more about what you mean, because you can't really. Are you talking about using like SceneKit or something like that, or for your shader like OpenGL ES? Well, I mean, essentially, you've got lower access to the hardware. I mean, I'm pretty sure the Metal API is pretty much just a wrapper on OpenGL. It's just kind of optimized for the hardware. But again, I mean, like the fact that it's such a thin layer of abstraction between actually like just putting memory into the physical memory addresses on your device, I mean, it's specially optimized for it, to be honest with you. Yeah. Any other questions? Go ahead.
I was about to say, I think what he means is more along the lines of like, you were talking about shared access memory
Yeah.
between the CPU and the GPU. OpenGL, you don't get that kind of control.
Yeah, and the reason you get that control is because, again, Apple has designed this API specifically to translate to hardware calls
So
and do
would
that.
be one benefit of using Metal over OpenGL, on top of the fact that Metal is actually a nicer API in general.
True. Yeah. True. I can't argue with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you were to display some code, it's Objective-C like. I mean, you still have pointers coming in and coming out.
Yeah.
But if you've ever had to worry about OpenGL, like you have to bind buffers and you have to bind vertex
Yeah.
arrays and you have to do calls at specific cycles and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And in Metal, it's more like at this one time you just call a function, you pass it everything that you need to have. And
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
do everything for
Yeah.
it.
Cool. Any other questions? Go. Yes, sir.
So would you really only use this for like some intense 3D game, or use it
Uh,
for any other?
I mean, you could. I mean, essentially, you want to do it so that you can get the most out of the hardware. Like Crytek just did this really cool rendition in Metal, which is, I think it's called like Challengers or something like that. But essentially, like they were able to do so many draw calls that they can enhance. Like it looks like PS3 graphics, honestly. So you would want to do it so that you can get out of your apps. Yes.
So is there any benefit, like is there any kind of enabling using physics with Metal? Physics calculations?
No, like pretty much, you don't really have too much access to the underlying kind of like calls and stuff like that. You can pretty much just use what Apple gives you. So,
Are there any limitations
as far as
instead of using or something like that?
uh,
Are there any like restrictions where you're going to end up defaulting to like OpenGL or something else?
I wouldn't say so. The API is pretty solid. I haven't seen any examples where you couldn't do something that you could implement in OpenGL. So I mean, I don't have enough information to really answer that.
Well, I guess another question is, does it make anything easier for like importing object models?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can pretty much import what you have, and it should work out of box, like out of
But I mean,
box.
like, versus, say, if you went at a high level language like SceneKit, initialize like, what is it? There's like an open standard that Blender and like Maya export to.
Yeah.
Like an object model. And what? Yeah, day files.
Okay. Yeah.
And you could just import those inside a SceneKit, and it will auto-calculate like vertices. And
Yeah, it still does that out of.
Does Metal have any kind of functionality like that?
Yeah. So I mean, if you're talking about like trying to find normals of vectors and stuff like that,
Instead
yes.
of having it like hard-coded or having to manually like specify vectors and normals.
Yeah, like it would just be a Metal call. You can look in the documentation, and they have like a whole bunch of stuff like that. So yeah.
We'll have you give another talk on that.
Yeah, part two's coming. Yeah.
All right, give me
All
the
right.
mic, my dear. All right. So now we have Chris giving his talk, which is
Hold on.
a special little add-on. We normally have two presenters, so we're able to.
nearly as smart as those guys, though, so I'm going to just keep it a little higher level. If you have real, ask them after the.
Clip that on for me.
But I am buying a round of beer later, so you guys have to sit here and listen to me for a few minutes.
All right. Hopefully we should be. You don't have a retina screen, do you?
I do.
All right.
We need to downsize the.
We have to play between one of the 1080s.
Oh, it's the collectibles. Yep.
Oh, the collectible.
There it is. Just totally dropped. There you go. It's one of the two. 1080. There's a 1080i and a 1080p that pop up. Here's the retina screen.
Yeah, that's what I have to.
Oh, well that worked for me then. Oh shoot, there we go.
We might just be able to do this.
Huh. Finally getting it down. No more two-player screen. Maybe watch. It's gonna jinx me next week. Watch. Next week I'm gonna have something that I can't freaking figure out. All right, you're good to go.
All right, so I'll give you a brief introduction about myself. My name's Chris, and I'm a developer evangelist at a company called Criticism. My background So I was actually born and raised over in Bradenton, Florida, just on the west coast, south of Tampa. I went to school up in Clemson in South Carolina, studied civil engineering for a while, and started kicking around code. I started writing widgets, which if you guys remember those before mobile phones came out, like the desktop widgets that Apple has. I wrote a YouTube one, it got like 1.5 million downloads. It was pretty awesome. It took me like a month to build and Apple kind of promoted it, but that got me hooked on coding. So when the iPhone came out, I was still in school and I figured, hey, I'll start building apps for this thing. So I did. And I dropped my civil engineering, went into computer science. I built an app out of my dorm room and sold it to a company in California about 5 years ago. So that's when I moved out west and worked for them for a little bit and built another app on the side. It got really successful and then I spun it out, raised funding for that. And now it's a 10-person company out in California. And I decided I want to work on something other than just apps. So now I'm with this company called Criticism, which I'll talk about a little bit more toward the end. I still develop apps on the side through this company called Whitewater Labs. It's just me and one other guy. But building apps is generally what I do. I really, really enjoy it, and any spare time that I get, that's what I'm working on. So how many of you have an app out in the App Store? You're working to get one out in the App Store, maybe your first one. Anybody? Most guys, hopefully? All right. So no matter what you guys are working on, I guarantee you there's already somebody out there that's doing something similar. No matter what it is, somebody's already done it to some degree. So this is a very unsettling slide because you get to see all these little icons on there. There's over 1.5 million apps in the App Store right now, in iTunes alone. So how do you compete against all this stuff, right? So if you take a look at Instagram, do you think they were the first photo sharing app? No, they were like the 6,000th photo sharing app. But they went about it a little bit differently. They focused on the performance and the user experience, and they ended up making a really solid app that was embraced by the users. So what were they able to do that the other 6,000 photo sharing apps weren't able to do? So I want to talk about how you can kind of stand out from the competition and how you can differentiate yourself. The first part is the idea, obviously. You don't want to just carbon copy something that's already out there, but you need to give yourself the edge every way that you can. And the first thing that I like to look at is the SEO in the actual App Store. So you have to understand that no matter how good your code is, this is where people go to download your app. You're competing immediately against all these other apps that are out there. How do you get in the top 5 or 10 search results? That's hugely important. So this is the app that I spun out. It's out there. It's an app called KeepSafe. And this app, it hides pictures behind a pin pad, essentially. But you'll notice that use your imagination on what it's for, right? I'll tell you the full story about it over beer later. But the app is called KeepSafe. But if you look at the title, you'll notice we didn't just call it KeepSafe because the brand didn't stand on its own. So we called it Hide Photos with KeepSafe, a private photo vault to lock your pictures. We jammed every single keyword we could think of into it just to get that edge because we knew the title was ranked highly in the search engine. And if somebody types in, I want to hide pictures on my iPhone, we're going to show up over all of our competitors who are just trying to live off only their brand name. So this is the first thing that we usually look at when we're launching apps. You'll notice our 5-star ratings down here. Yeah, a lot of them. That's kind of the underlying theme for the talk, I guess, is how to keep those ratings up because that plays into the search engine.
So
Yeah.
did you guys discover the character limit on the app?
We did, and Apple is actually starting to crack down on stuff like this. You can still get away with it, and I do. So you just need to push the limits. I've been rejected just because of my title more times than I'd like to admit. But it does still work, and we still have a very similar title out there right now.
So does it matter where that keyword hide photos resides? I mean, I see that.
Like within the actual title?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't have any direct results, like it works better at the beginning or at the end. We just threw everything we could in there, and we saw our SEO went up tremendously just from throwing it all in there.
That's your current icon in the App Store?
No, this is older. You could tell it's like iOS 6 or something. This is just the old screenshot I have lying around. Honestly, when I left the team, the ratings kind of went down, so I don't like showing that as much. But it's a direct correlation to me not being there anymore. Yeah.
So, that's really interesting, typing in keywords in the title. console search, does it not typically parse the metadata for like the tags inside the store? I'm just wondering because like when you submit to the store, you have metadata tags that you associate with your app.
Right.
So I was wondering if this trumps those metadata tags that you go over.
I don't know if it trumps it. I don't know how the actual algorithm works. I know this up here is ranked way higher than like putting it in your description. We know that 100%, but I think the keywords might still reign supreme. And those you can only change every time you update a version, right? So, but I don't know 100%, don't quote me on it, but I think the keywords are still number one and then title is a close second. Yeah.
Okay, so this morning, I typed in hide photos on my iOS device, and it actually came up with Keepsafe, and I downloaded it this morning.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Hey. That's the coolest thing as an app developer.
That's exactly what I did.
So, and it worked.
Yeah.
And it worked. And that's why it's got about 30 million monthly active users now. And we raised about $4 million in funding. So it's off and it's moving. So when I built that YouTube widget that I was talking about earlier, when I was in college, I actually was looking over my TA's shoulder in chemistry lab, and he pulled up the YouTube widget to show us all a video in class. And that for me was like somebody I didn't recommend it to is out using my software. Yeah. And that's when I totally got hooked on this type of stuff. So I love hearing stories like this. So how do we get all these good ratings? You can kind of hope that people go into the App Store organically, but the fact of the matter is that doesn't always work. So at least you've seen these as a user. If you haven't plugged it into your app yet, these annoying UI alert views that show up and say, hey, give us a rating on the App Store. You see them so often because they actually work. They really, really work. That's how we get 516 five-star ratings. Overnight, when we plug that in, it helped. So plug this thing into your app if you don't have it already. I use this tool, this open source tool called Apparator. It's out on GitHub. It's hugely popular. Criticism makes one, but it's not as good, so don't use that. Don't tell my boss I said that. But Apparator is very good, and you can do things like configure how long after the person first opens the app that this alert will show up. And that's something that you need to think about as a developer, because if a user opens your app for the first time and this rating screen pops up, even the first day, that's really going to irritate the user because they're still trying to understand your app and kind of understand what it does, get used to it, start to enjoy it, and this is just going to piss them off. So if you pop that in, Apparator is configurable, so you can say, after at least 7 days and after at least 20 app loads, then show this screen. So you kind of increase the user experience and make your users a little happier, and make them a little more likely to go in and give you a good rating. So one thing we did over at KeepSafe, you'll notice the difference between these two screens. This is the first one, this is the second one. So the difference there is we changed the title. We changed it from Rate Us to Rate Us 5 stars. And I kid you not, this helped overnight again. We saw a 0.2 star increase within a week. So even just being explicit and telling the user, hey, go do this, that psychological thing that clicks in their mind actually makes them go rate you 5 stars instead of 4 stars, 3 stars. So always be playing around with the title, the actual descriptions and things like that.
And why did you change the button order?
So this is by default the cancel button in the UI alert view. So if you fill out the code, this is the last one that shows up. Users kind of click that by default. You don't want them to automatically click no thanks without reading it. So you want them to think about it. So they say, sure, take me there. Ooh, maybe I don't want to do this. But you make the no thanks a little bit harder to get to. So that was a good eye that you noticed that. So the last one here that I have is even one step farther, which is this no right here. And I've heard about this. I've never used it myself, but people making you feel guilty about clicking no, because the user's going to see this like, no, I don't hate you, and I definitely don't hate your puppy. So I'm not going to click that. Maybe I'll click maybe later, or go ahead and take me to the App Store.
I've actually seen that crop up in a ton of apps recently.
Because it works, man. Like the numbers are there.
I pressed that no button and I felt really bad.
So,
As a developer, it's even worse because you're pressing that no button like, oh, sorry, man.
and it gives you a little personality, right? So, as a user, you like to see that your app is not just created by some large corporation. You actually start to think about the developers and the people that went into it. So another reason they might give you 5 stars. So I told you I started as a civil engineer, went into computer science. This was really hard for me to understand that design actually mattered. I was pretty convinced that a great algorithm and great code behind the scenes, that's what people really love in an app, right? I launched my first app a couple months after the App Store opened. So I kind of got away with it to some extent because there was so few apps out there that I had terrible design. It was just god awful. I don't ever show screens of that one anymore because it was bad, but it was very successful. But this day and age, you have to have good design. You think about it, it's the user's first touch point with your app, even through the iTunes store. You look at, you're scrolling through, you see icons, and for you in your head, the icons kind of trigger something. If an icon looks good, you're more likely to stop and look at the actual app. So the icons, the screenshots, all this stuff actually plays into whether or not the user first downloads your app, and that's the most critical part for user acquisition. So don't show this to a designer and give their ego this huge boost because they don't necessarily need that. You want to make sure you hold them to it. You want to make sure they're doing their due diligence and not just handing you Photoshop files or PNGs or something like that. You want them to think about what happens when you click this button down here. What kind of animation pops up? What kind of fades transition the screens back and forth? Because it's not just about static screens making them look pretty. It's about how the whole flow works together and how the whole user experience is. So make sure your designer's thinking about all this stuff and make sure you give them a big hug at the end of the day because you do need them as an engineer. So another thing I like to do, this is a finance tracker, another one of my apps, and we basically have this list of currencies in the app. And it's just me writing the code and then I've got my designer guy. So we knew that we couldn't add every single currency to the app in the first version. So we knew that we envisioned this use case where a user is going through looking for their currency. They're kind of scrolling through this list, looking for it, and they don't find it. So they get to the bottom and they're really pissed off. They want to throw you and your puppy off the cliff, and you don't want that. You don't want them, even worse, they're going to go to the App Store and rate you 1 star. That's what you really got to keep them away from doing. So we put this button at the bottom that says request another currency because we understood that the user is going to get here and have some kind of pain point. We want to contain that. So this opens up a nice support window that says, hey, shoot us an email, tell us which currency you're looking for. So this does a couple of things. It keeps them out of the App Store and it gets you direct feedback as to what your users actually want. So when this user opens the app 2 weeks later and your next iteration has their currency in there, they went from deleting your app and rating you 1 star to having a very positive experience, and now they're psyched that you actually listened to their request and we put their currency into the app. So even something as simple as just putting a button where we knew there was going to be a limitation, it keeps those gnarly 1 stars out of the App Store. And one service I want to recommend for that is User Voice. It's an SDK that you can just pop into your app, one of those 2 lines of code type things. And it just is a direct line of feedback between you and your users. So they'll send you a message, or they can submit an idea to the forum, and users can upvote and downvote ideas. So you can actually get some positive feedback and see what users are looking for. The problem is that, you had a question?
Yeah, about feedback forums. So if you're a small team and you don't have dedicated people going through those forums, would you recommend doing something like that over doing something like an actual support email system where they just fire off like email requests that go and are parsed through? Because I'm thinking about like which one's easier to manage.
So the form, this knowledge base that I have here, it just kind of goes out on its own. Honestly, I rarely look at it, only when I have time to see the top few. I get support emails from all kinds of people every single day because this send a message at the top, it just sends an email to support at my company. So I do have to deal with emails most of the time, and that's the primary way for people to reach out. And I think when they send you an email, they're expecting a response. When they just post something here, they're not necessarily. They just want you to see it. They just want to know that you're seeing it as a developer to know that these are the things people might actually want. So
does the forum like help filter through other people complaining about the same thing?
Yeah. So the idea is that if they go into the feedback forum and they see their question already there, maybe somebody in the community has already answered it, or at least they know it's already being addressed. So yeah, that does help, but you're still going to get some ridiculous support requests. And one thing I'll mention, I'll try not to go too long here, but kind of a side story. We translated one of my apps, and because we noticed it got really popular in Brazil. It's like the top 5 in finance in Brazil for some reason. Couldn't tell you why. But we converted the languages into Portuguese for Brazil. We just localized it. So now I get all kinds of support requests in Portuguese, which was great because our downloads spiked over there. Everybody loves seeing it in their own language, but they thought we had a Portuguese support team. So be very careful when you do stuff like that, because your support inbox could just get flooded with things that you don't want to Google Translate, because then you're going to look like an idiot, which I've done personally many, many times. Wouldn't recommend it. So moving on from user voice, users can tell you what they want, but most of the time users are idiots and don't know what they want. So I use a tool called Flurry. It's an analytics tool. Google Analytics is another one. Mixpanel is another. You name them, they're out there. But it's a nice way to see which features users are actually using in your app. So instead of hoping that small 1% that's very vocal is going to reach out to you and tell you what they want, you can look at what 100% of your users are up to. Which features should you actually focus on as a developer that are really being used, and which ones might you want to cut out that are only seeing 1% usage. So Flurry is a nice tool for that. It's free. Just plug it into your app. It's 5 minutes or less. One thing that they do very well that I want to focus on is user retention. And when you're looking at monetizing an app, user retention is the #1 thing you need to look at. It's great to see how many sessions you're having per day, how many downloads you're getting every day. But you're not going to make any. You could get 1 million downloads in a day. If they all delete the app tomorrow, you're not going to make any money off it. So by having these users come back 7 days, 14 days, 6 months, a year later, that's when you really start to monetize. So this user retention metric is very, very important. And you all know Evernote, I assume, right? So Evernote does retention extremely well. And their CEO came out a little while back and said that they tracked their first 11,000 users across a couple years' time. So the first month, these 11,000 users generated $700 in revenue for Evernote. 2 years later, the same cohort of 11,000 users were generating $11,000 in revenue a month. So just across 2 years, having that stickiness, their service was able to generate enough value to these users that it was less painful for the users to pay Evernote than it was for them to rip out all of their data and go find another free service. So once you find that sweet spot, that's when you're really making it as a developer, and that's where you're going to see the money really start to roll in. Yep.
So I've never used Flurry before, and I've used Google Analytics a lot. Does Flurry collect data for themselves? Like Google Analytics, one of the things I don't like about it is Google's a dog. And they love collecting everything that's not related to them, but related to you and your users.
Oh, of course.
Is Flurry more private?
No,
Kind of data,
not at all.
or do they do the exact same thing?
No, they were very explicit from the beginning that they are using this data, not necessarily for advertisements. That came a little bit later. But they were using it for industry reports, kind of selling it to analysts, things like that. It was never any PII or anything. But once their company kind of evolved a little bit, they got into advertising, and then they ended up getting bought by Yahoo. So Yahoo's trying to use some of that data for their advertising networks.
Do you know of any good analytics system that doesn't do that?
Mixpanel is one that I've been using lately. The only caveat is it's expensive. The services that you pay for, you're going to get that data security, but you have to pay for them, right? So it's a trade-off as a developer, what's most important to you. So these are the two big analytics providers. Mixpanel was the third. This doesn't paint the whole picture for analytics. So Flurry, I mentioned, got bought by Yahoo. Yahoo is one of our biggest customers at Criticism. And then Google Analytics, the guy who started Google Analytics sat on our board for a while, and now Google is one of our big investors. So they recognized that the analytics tools they were providing weren't telling the whole story, and there was another piece. So that's what Criticism does. I'll just talk a minute about this. We're an SDK for app performance. And essentially what that is what do you do if your deployed app breaks on a user? You've had apps crash on you no doubt. What do you do as a developer when that happens? Back in the good old days, I would see something like this. I would go in the App Store, look at my app, and there's a 1-star review. And it says, oh, this app is crashing, and it sucks, I'm going to delete it now. As a developer, I would have to I'd look at this. It doesn't even show operating system or device or anything. It gives me no context into the crash. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, maybe I can look up this person on Twitter and see if they use the same Twitter handle. Best case scenario, line to the user, and then they say something like, I don't know, I think my iPhone's just broken. Oh, all right, I'll go ahead and fix that bug then. There was no way for me to figure out what was going wrong. So system solves. It's a small SDK that you pop in, and it sits in the monitors for crashes. So anytime something breaks, we gather up the stack trace, any context around it, what operating system are they on, were they on Wi-Fi, which carrier, even the steps that the user took leading up to the crash, we can tell all that and send it back to the developers so you can figure out what went wrong and essentially how you can fix it. So there's a couple services that we kind of tacked on, but crash reporting is definitely the core. And I've been working for Criticism for about 3 months now, but I've been using them in my product for about 4 years. And I would go around and I'd give talks every now and again about building apps. And I would plug Criticism kind of at the end of it before I worked there. And one of the guys from Criticism saw me do that one time and said, hey, you should come get paid to do this. So I was like, all right, that's why I'm here. But it's a pretty slick tool. This is an example. I don't know, it might be a little hard to see. I'll throw the slides up later. But it's a step-by-step process. They went from LT to Edge. They clicked this button. They made this API call. Things happened. The internet connection went down, and then it crashed. So it shows you this whole trace of what the user was up to give you a little more information on why the crash might have happened. And back when I first started KeepSafe, we had a few million users at the time, and I was the only iOS guy. And I put out a release for iOS 6 point whatever. And I put in an API. I didn't fully test because I'm a terrible developer. I put out an API that didn't work in iOS 5, just 5.0. It worked in 5.1. So I put out the release. It's all going well. And then I get 500 emails from Criticism saying your app is crashing. And I went in. I had over 10,000 crashes within about 2 hours because every time I was opening the app on iOS 5, it was crashing on them. So me as a developer, I would have seen that in the App Store under a 1-star review eventually, maybe. But Criticism was able to let me know within an hour. And I was able to go in and fix it and get a hotfix out by the end of the day. So that was when I was really sold on this as a service because they were able to show me exactly what was going wrong without me having to go out and talk to the users. So that's why I'm a big fan. And these guys are also big fans. You might have heard of some of them. On over 20,000 apps and over 1 billion different devices. And we process about 30 billion events per day. So it's a pretty heavy-duty company. If you're a back-end engineer, we're hiring like crazy because our Amazon instances are just on fire. So if you're looking for a job, we're also hiring.
So I have 2 questions.
Yep.
One, what do you guys offer that somebody, say, Crashlytics and test crash reports with?
So Crashlytics, they focus on just the crash. So they'll send you the stack trace, show you how many times it happened, things like that. But we do HTTP service monitoring. So every network request that goes in and out, we're able to let you know if, let's say you've got an ad service plugged in, we're able to let you know what the latency is on all those ads coming in and out, if there are error rates higher than 50%, let's say. And we're able to show you geographic regions where these HTTP errors might be occurring. So let's say you've got an ad network in and it's working very, very poorly in China. You might not know that as a developer unless you see this dashboard and China's bright red showing 98% error rates. You might want to go in then and put in a different ad SDK for that region. So we offer HTTP service monitoring was another big one that we laid on top. And then we offer a new service called transaction monitoring, which helps you kind of monitor a checkout flow and see how much revenue you might be losing. That was the screen that I kind of glossed over. So you can tie revenue lost into performance issues. So you as a developer, you might want to go in and fix not necessarily the crashes that are happening the most, but which ones are causing you the most loss in revenue. So maybe your shopping cart is only crashing on 5% of your users. you might want to focus on that crash before you focus on something generic that's affecting 20% of your users. So we're adding like business layers on top of the crash reporting.
My other question's a technical question. Have you implemented your guys' technology before?
But you will after today.
Yeah. But I'm assuming you guys have a similar setup with a key and everything inside of the app delegate.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered. I've never got a chance to actually ask somebody how they implemented it, and I've never gotten to look inside the SDK. How do you guys intercept those calls?
Intercept like the HTTP calls?
Well, you're also monitoring taps and stuff like that. So without like becoming the listener inside the main file for forwarding events, like how do you guys monitor those event calls?
So we don't monitor button taps implicitly. You as the developer need to say the user tapped this button.
Okay.
So through a single line of code.
That you want to go through.
Exactly, because we don't want to just send everything. There might be things that are critical to you as a developer, like this particular set of buttons might be more critical than just everything that's happening in the app. So you kind of define them yourself. And as for the network requests, we basically sit on a delegate, like a system level delegate. So as soon as our SDK is initialized, our delegate starts listening. So then any network request, we just gather the metadata in and out, so you're not actually piping it through our SDK. So we're seeing, okay, the request is starting now, it's ending now. That's how we're able to tell the latency. And we're able to get like status codes, payload size, things like that as well.
And how hard is it to state? Because you've got a million different states to worry about when it comes to syncing this data back and forth. Like when a crash occurs and the app's about to crash, are there like many timing concerns that you have to worry about? Setting it up,
Yeah, so
saving it, and
depending on the type of crash, sometimes we get a few seconds where we can actually pop it up.
Yeah.
But if it's a really gnarly crash, we have to wait till the next app open. So there's things we have to prioritize internally. Okay, what are we sending up first? Generally, we just gzip as much as we can grab and then pop it up when it makes sense. But for crashes and really high priority events, we pop those, can grab them and get an internet connection.
do you usually save your stuff first, or do you just pop them up as soon as you get them?
No, it's all stored locally. So
That's
and then
sure, like when a crash happens, you can't pop it up. It's just
yeah, it sits locally until we throw it up, and then we delete it locally so it doesn't take up space.
That makes sense. Okay. Just curious.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, just trying to get rid of these 1-star crashes and make us all very happy and rich critters. So that's my spiel. I've got my contact info at that link if anybody's interested. Again, we'll throw the slides up. I also have an offer from Criticism if you're so inclined. And I brought a big bag of critters with me, these little guys. And I don't want to go back to California with all those critters, so make sure you all steal some from me before you leave. All right, thank you. Question?
Yeah, so which of your main features are mostly implemented? Like I just have to call a few lines versus ones that I would have to place my code at specific places.
So the HTTP service monitoring and crash reporting are all automatic. There's features you add on top, like the breadcrumbs, like this button, that button, this button. It's just one lines of code. If you're tracking analytics, you might use the same tags for your analytics. And transactions is our heavy duty one that tracks every single step. And that's actually pretty automatic. You just have to say transaction start and transaction end. And then we'll take a look at every little thing that happens along the way. That's pretty heavy duty stuff though, so I wouldn't recommend doing it in your whole code base, just like shopping cart flows and things like that. But it's generally just 1 or 2 lines of code, pretty lightweight, and you can get started just by popping in the SDK and kind of build out as you see that you might need new features. Yeah,
Last question.
no worries.
Do you guys have any weird core data bugs?
We don't use core data.
Good.
Yeah.
Because like
Some of our competitors do though, and I really hate it because it causes, I see crashes from crash reporting tools. And when you see that, you delete the crash reporting tool.
oh my god, I have so many core data issues.
Yeah.
Even merging context and everything, like explicitly not listen for this store over here, and explicitly avoid this over here. And when you start doing complicated stuff, so that's
Yeah.
Then, if you guys don't use Corday, my other question is, do you have any multi-threading things you have to watch out for?
Some multi-threading things. Honestly, we're the most stable crash reporting SDK out there just because we're on so many apps and we've been around 4 or 5 years. We've seen just about everything there is to see. So yeah, there's going to be issues that come up, but the fraction of times that it happens is negligible. So we're always working to make it better, but we're able to process so much data and see so many different scenarios that our bug bashing internally has actually gotten pretty good too. So. Any other questions? We'll be drinking beer here in a little bit. I don't want to stand between developers and their beer, so I better get right on. Thanks again.